Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another episode of Two Economists and a Lender, where we take a deep dive into the most important economic issues facing agriculture. I'm your host, Carly Jacobson. David Widmar and Brent Gloy are back with us from Agricultural Economic Insights, along with Travis Meisgeier, a financial services officer here at Farm Credit. So having a pipeline of insights and sounding boards is critical to keeping up with the evolving landscape of the ag industry, which you all know since you've chosen to be here with us today. And we're going to really dig in more and share some guidance on how to evaluate and build out that bench of advisors. Brent, let me get this kicked on over to you.
Thank you, Carly. Great to be with everybody today. We are looking forward to this episode today because it's one we've been talking about for a little while. And the topic is really trusted advisors. And the goal of all of this, one of the goals of this whole series is really to help you make better decisions. And we think that building a good bench of trusted advisors can help you make better decisions. And I've heard this quote a few times. I think David probably sent it to me or somebody a long time ago. But what it says is you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And I think about that a fair amount because I made a pretty big life change when I left the university. And it's interesting, not good, not bad, just interesting how, the people you spend the most time with kind of shape what you're thinking about, somehow you're thinking about it, some of the things you do, all of those kinds of things. So I think it's really important to kind of sit back and reflect a little bit who you're surrounding yourself with. And I think in our business, that's really, really important because the people that we're talking about to the most are going to influence us the most, whether they're trying to or not. They're just going to influence our thinking. This topic also reminds me a little bit of Danny Kleinfelter, who's a professor of farm management at Texas A&M, just very recently passed away, unfortunately. And one of his passions was helping farms set up peer groups. And part of his thinking was that you want to get input from peers, from other farms that are in the similar situation, because you can learn a lot. You can learn a lot from those advisors. And so you spend a lot of time trying to put those peer networks together. We're not talking about peer networks today. We're going to talk about trusted advisors. So what we want to do is help you think about that. And Carly, let's go ahead and start with a little bit of a poll. One of the things that's kind of interesting to look at is who is your most trusted professional advisor? And remember, we said trusted professional advisors, your agronomist, lender, legal counsel, maybe your accountant, or even your grain livestock marketing person. So of those 5 choices, who do you find to be your most trusted professional advisor? Take a minute and click that survey. There's been a lot of research on this. David will probably fill you in a little bit on some of that here in a second as the results come up. As we start to build these advisory teams, I think it's important to think about who's on it and what kind of input you're getting from them. So accountant actually scored the highest. David and I had a little bet. We never set the stakes. So I probably won a lot of money here today because my guess was the highest anyway. Just an inside joke.
And Brent, just to build off that a little bit, we had previously at universities been a part of surveys that put lenders at a very high rank when it came to this trusted advisor. So I think it's worth just spending a little bit of time thinking about this, and appreciate everybody participating in this, but we're going to dive into this a little bit more. So Brent, tell us a little bit about the process for maybe improving.
Yeah, as we think about this, we want to have this kind of circular effort where we start to think about, well, what are we currently doing? Okay. What needs do we still have left unmet? and then how can we improve that process? And David, you like to use that example of a t-ball team, I think.
Yeah, I think most of us can relate to the little league team or maybe high school sports where these coaches get given a pool of talent. They're not really, they're kind of geographically limited as to how they're going to get a eventual winning successful team on the field. But think about, how do you recruit of that talent that lives in this school district or in this t-ball district? How do you get folks recruited to play the sport? How do you get them active into that team? How do you find their strengths and their weaknesses? How do you put together positions, and how do you put together a plan to play these different games? And oftentimes a similarity here is born into a geography or into a family that has a lot of trusted advisors in there. But our goal as individuals who want to make better decisions is, how can we continue to improve that bench? How do we find the right people at the right time to help us solve the right challenges that maybe our operation is working through, or the opportunities that we're considering? And so, there's kind of a couple ways to think about this. One is like, just kind of a product of the environment that I'm in. But I think we want to step past that and say, well, how do we make sure that we're curating that feedback that is valuable to us in the right place at the right time for the right issue?
Yeah. And I think that's important, especially for younger and beginning farmers, because where, as David, you might have inherited a team of advisors that worked well for maybe your parents or the senior generation, but sometimes it's important to kind of get your own set of people. I'm not saying throw all the other ones away. You want to take input, but it's also good to kind of bring in a group that you can communicate with as well.
So, Brent, we're going to walk through each of those three parts of that step that we talked about and share some thoughts to help all the listeners today take these lessons back to their operation and start making some improvements in their bench and their process and how they're using that. So the first step here is review your current efforts. We're all doing this automatically. We're doing it maybe in a passive way. And so the idea here is, how can we be a little more intentional? And the first step is do a bit of an inventory. Who do you turn to for input? Is that relationship formal or informal? And as you start to unpack this, you're going to find out that maybe there are some advisors who you ask a certain set of questions, and maybe there's some friends who you ask a different set of questions. And the idea here, as you map out the people and the topics, maybe you start to identify, okay, there are issues that maybe I'm not as open to get feedback on. I'm not as open of getting this topic, that feedback on. So start here by just doing a bit of a review. And I want to underscore another point here that I mentioned earlier is, think about relationships being formal or informal. Do these folks know that they are a trusted advisor of yours? Maybe they're in professional, maybe they're in a personal capacity. Do they know that you're relying on that input to help move your business forward? Not saying good one way or bad the other way, but just think consciously about that relationship you have and how it's structured, and that could be important sort of in this inventory process as we move to the next steps, and thinking about how we can improve that process. The second consideration here is consider your specific needs. First off, one way we can think about these needs is to think about our key business activities. Are we a livestock operation versus a crop operation? If we're looking to add one of these enterprises, maybe we need to have more trusted advisors to help us with the agronomy issues or the feed issues or the calving issues. Maybe we just need to add more expertise as we develop these parts of our businesses or grow them. Another way we can think about our needs is through the business functions. Maybe there's the production, actually raising the grain or raising the livestock. There are financial functions, HR functions, risk management functions. And so you can go through here and think about those key activities and key functions and where you might have some needs for trusted advisors to help out. Another consideration here is thinking about the current challenges your operation might face, or the future opportunities, the future plans. When you sit down and say, okay, what's holding us back from reaching our current goals? And then what are those long-term goals that we're working towards? This could be a way for you to really step back and consider those needs that your operation has in store. The third point here I want to talk about, this kind of get a little bit more on the personal side, building off that idea that we talked about earlier about you might have inherited a set of advisors, or maybe there's advisors that helping other members of your team, but we all have very unique blind spots. Part of our personality, part of our background, our education, or just the general quirks in our being. We have blind spots, and the thing about blind spots that are really tricky is we often don't know that they're there. And second of all, when we get into trouble with them, we're quick to, blame somebody else. So I always think about my grandmother growing up. She lived at this house for most of her entire life, and she's backing down the driveway one day at this dinner party, and everybody was in the yard, and she hit this big oak tree. It's an 80-year-old oak tree. She comes flying out of the car and said, "Who planted that tree there?" It's like, well, Grandma, that tree's older than you are. It's a giant tree. You've known that trees are there for a long time, but it's really important to think about our own personal blind spots. Maybe there are just issues around finance, or I grew up on my activities on the farm. I didn't like baling hay. That was sort of this activity I didn't like to do. It was sort of a blind spot. I never really wanted to think about it. I never wanted to apply any, mental capacity to it, because it was a spot that I wasn't very excited about. So this is something we can all think about personally. Another consideration here, and when you're thinking about your operation needs, is remember that not all of the experts are all the same. There are lawyers who we might need to tap into very different sets of circumstances. Maybe we've been using a lawyer to help write contracts for rental agreements or buying farmland, but maybe we now have a transition issue. Maybe we need to have a little different lawyer to help us navigate that. Similar with accountants. Maybe there are accountants that do a really good job for tax planning purposes, or helping us prepare our quarterly financial estimates. We want to make sure we have the right accounting team to help us think through that. But you can go through all of these different experts, have different skill sets, and we want to make sure that we have the right one lined up for the needs of our business. And finally, building off that individual personal level is the personality fit. That could be an important consideration. There could be somebody who's a really great expert in this topic, but there might just be a mismatch in personality, or maybe there's an opportunity whenever you transition the leadership of an organization. Maybe there's a great expert that's in helping your father, or might be helping your children and the next generation, but isn't a great personality fit for you. That's just important to keep in mind, important to reflect on, because ultimately these trusted advisors have to be someone you trust. And there's a combination of competency and just the trust factor. So we want to keep that in mind. Step 3 here is improving the process. It's always about iterating and making small steps forward over a long period of time. And so it's always important to think about how can we improve. So the first step we have for you to think about is refine how background information, or review how background information is shared. How are we going about preparing for the conversation that we want to have with that trusted advisor? Maybe it's a group of friends at a coffee shop, maybe it's an accountant, or maybe it's our lender. How are we going to prepare for that? We spend 365 days a year, at least 12 hours a day, thinking about our business and maybe the challenges that the business is facing. But how do we, boil that down into enough of a conversation starter that you can start to glean some insights? We want to be very focused in the information that we bring to them. We want to make sure we're bringing, the important pieces of information, and we want to be clear in the questions or the uncertainties that we're thinking about. Oftentimes, preparing for that conversation in and of itself can be really powerful in improving and thinking about your thinking. Another consideration is the type of input you might be wanting to receive. There are a couple different ways that you can get input and feedback. One of those is maybe strategic, and the other one is tactical. So, for example, here is maybe you think about what should be the right amount of fertilizer that I put on my corn crop in 2024. So you can go to one agronomist, and they might give you a specific number, 185 pounds per acre. And that's a very specific answer. That can be a very tactical type of feedback. Another type of feedback you might get could be from, let's say, kind of this university type of feedback, or this consultant type of feedback. Well, what crop did you plant last year? What are your soil type profiles? What's your soil type like? What are your soil tests tell you the last time you did soil tests? And they might give you sort of the path or the method for answering that question yourself. And that's always important to think about, sort of this idea of, give a man a fish or you teach the man to fish. This is the idea here of, do you want to answer, do you want to fish, or do you want to learn how to go about, solving this question for yourself in the long term? Finally, routinely revisit the topic of improving. Your operation is going to change and evolve and grow. You're going to be learning things. You're going to be forgetting things. It's going to be important for you to always be updating this feedback process to make sure that you're always improving your progress as you move forward.
Thanks, David. I think to offer a few kind of parting thoughts. One of the things David's tried to do here is outline a process for you as you think about your advisors. And if you've watched many of our webinars, you know we're big about process, and as David said, we're big about marginal improvement, getting a little bit better over time, consistently over time, getting better. And so the first thing that he talked about was, what are your current efforts in this place? Who are your current advisors? Who are those 5 people that you spend the most time with? You're surrounding yourself. What are needs or gaps in those areas? And then how can we improve, and kind of being systematic and diligent about it. And I think as you build this advisory bench, part of it can be a bench, part of it could be even more formal, and you have to think about what is the structure. Do we have do we invite individual advisors to our business meeting, which if you haven't seen our webinar on business meetings, it'd be a good one to go back and revisit. How formal or informal is it? And a lot of us aren't very formal people, so going from like really informal, just a phone call every now and then, to something more formal. Hey, let's have a meeting, let's have an agenda, let's talk through some things, is a big leap. And so how much structure do we want to add to it? The other thing I think that is if you get into a really good advisor relationship, and B is just that voice of accountability. And as we were talking yesterday after we practiced for this webinar, a couple people mentioned, sometimes we're trying new things we don't tell other people because we don't want that accountability that comes with, oh, if I said I was going to do this, I'm going to do it. So we kind of like hedge on it. But accountability can be a really important part of having a good team of advisors, because they can help you say, hey, I thought you were going to do this. And I find that with David a lot. Like, he'll say, well, you said that your marketing was here, and why, what are you waiting for, kind of thing. That's really useful because it kind of snaps us out of it. I think at the end of the day, though, with these advisors, the problem isn't really finding opinions. There are lots of opinions out there. It's sorting through all that noise, and there's just a ton of stuff coming at you all the time. And if you're not strategic about how you're filtering that and thinking about it, I think it can be a little bit overwhelming, and it can lead us down probably some paths we don't want to. So I think deciding what information we want is harder than getting the input. And the other issue is that as we start to gather that input, sometimes we get in that mode of, we had a webinar on the OODA loop, which is observe, orient, decide, and act. And we talked a lot about how we like to observe the environment. We like to spend time orienting. And sometimes we get stuck deciding or taking action. And so sometimes we just gather and never make decisions based on it. So we want to avoid that as well. And we'll kind of close with a thought, and I think David attributed this to our host, Carly Jacobson. So if you surround yourself with people that think like you and confirm what you already had in mind, it's not really a bench of advisors, it's an echo chamber. And David and I talk about echo chambers a lot. And what that is you get into a place where everybody's just parroting back the same ideas. It's the old preaching to the choir kind of idea. And so as we build your advisors, you want to find people that will give you honest and not self-serving information.
So Brent, now we're going to invite Travis to join this part of the conversation, and we're going to have a quick conversation with him. And then also, as a reminder, at the 30-minute mark, we're going to wrap up and do the overtime Q&A. So invite all the listeners today to submit your questions for Brent, myself, and Travis to answer once we hit that 30-minute mark. So Travis, thanks so much for joining us today and helping us prepare for this topic. You've had a lot of great insights, and we want to share those now. Before we kick that off, let's have you tell us a little bit about yourself.
appreciate you guys giving me the opportunity to be part of this episode today. Advisory boards are something I think are very important for everyone, whether you're just an individual or someone trying to run a business. So looking forward to having this discussion today. So thanks for the opportunity. But a little bit about myself. I grew up in Northeast Iowa, involved in agriculture, but not directly from a production ag family. I knew at a young age I probably wouldn't be involved in production ag itself, but knew I wanted to be involved in agriculture in some fashion. So anyways, fast forward, I went to Iowa State University, got a degree in agricultural business. And while I was at Iowa State, had the opportunity to be introduced to Farm Credit Services of America in the form of an internship. And then, kind of one thing led to another. From that internship, I had the opportunity to join the team at Farm Credit full time up in the Mason City, Iowa office. So I was up there for about 3.5 years, working with all sizes of row crop operations. And then in 2020, I had the opportunity to relocate to Southeast Iowa to be closer to my now wife. So I've been down here in Mount Pleasant, Iowa for about 3.5 years as well, working primarily with large full-time row crop operations, helping them to continue to grow their operation, as well as introducing new operations to Farm Credit Services of America.
Well, great. Thank you for that. Curious, as we dive into this topic, do you have a personal bench of advisors that you turn to? And if so, how do you use them?
Yeah, so I do have my own bench of advisors, and I would say I really almost have two different types of advisors. I have advisors that I turn to for personal things, and I also have advisors that I look to develop my professional career. Some of these people I've known for years, and others I've recently been introduced to. It's really a good mix of personal and professional, and how I view my advisors, David, is really that they're here to help guide me, but not to tell me what to do. I don't always take their advice exactly, but I do always strongly consider their advice. Here's my opinion. At the end of the day, you're the decision maker for your life, whether it's personal or business. So your advisors can be there to help you make good decisions, and they should be there to help you make good decisions. But at the end of the day, they're not here to make the decisions for you. That's ultimately your decision.
I think it's a really powerful distinction there between who makes the decision, and it's ultimately our individual responsibility. So really appreciate that. So lenders are often viewed as that trusted advisor. It wasn't in the top position here in this survey, but it was definitely up there. As a lender, I'm curious to have your feedback on that. First, why do you think lenders are often highly ranked in this trusted advisor role? And then two, what happens when your expertise as a lender maybe doesn't line up with where the operation is growing and headed in the future?
There's a lot to that question, so I'll start unpacking that. And I think that there's really a couple reasons why lenders are frequently viewed as one of their top trusted advisors. The first one with that is finances are a very personal subject for many people, for most people, I would say. And as lenders, we handle all their finances and know more about their finances than really anyone else does. So people put a lot of trust in us for that. I think we're also viewed as ethical and honest professionals that are here to help them succeed. Specifically, at Farm Credit Services of America, a lending relationship, it's a team effort. And when the operation is successful, then the co-op is successful as well. So that's another reason I think that they turn to us. So that's the main reason I think we're often the first phone call they make. But I do think that there's another reason, and I don't mean to be funny when I say this, but I think there's some truth to it, that people call us sometimes because we don't have a billable hourly rate like other advisors may. Examples of this may be your accountant or your attorney or even your machinery mechanic. Each of these individuals are experts in their specific field, but oftentimes if you pick up the phone and call them, you may get a bill in the mail a few weeks later. So with that being said, I try to be an expert in my field, which is, again, lending. But oftentimes I get asked questions that are outside of my realm of expertise. And in that situation, you simply have to refer refer that question to the person who is the trusted expert in that area. So there's an old saying out there that's you get what you paid for. And I really think that there's some truth to that, David. There are times it's, in my opinion, necessary to pay a little bit of money to gain a lot of good advice. So I would just tell people, as you're looking at who you frequently call or for your first call of advice, ask yourself the question, is this the person that can give me the absolute best? And then kind of moving on to the second part of your question there about what if your advisor's opinion doesn't line up with where you're at, or what if you've kind of outgrown your advisor? I would say I think it's very important to remember that your advisors can and should change. A unique thing about Farm Credit Services of America is really every lender here is an expert in agriculture, because that's all that we do. But I would still say that different people within this company are very much experts in different areas of agriculture. I think that's important to remember. And another thing about advisors is that utilize advisors to help build your network. Advisors know a lot of other people who are very knowledgeable in their specific areas of expertise. So really utilize your advisors to continue to grow your board of advisors. And I have a quick story I want to kind of share on this topic. A few years ago, I was working with an operation who was looking at making a pretty substantial change to how they've ever done business. They had historically been a hog operation that owned sows and farrowed and then raised those feeder pigs up to market hogs, and they owned the pigs all the way through. They were looking at making a change to potentially exit the sow part of the business, and they looked to me for some professional advice on what are our options? What do you think we should do? They were thinking, do we buy into a sow unit? Do we buy feeder pigs on the open market, or do we go to some form of integrated feeding where we don't have any ownership in the pigs? And I would say I figured out pretty quickly that I probably was not the expert in that specific field. Going back to what I said a minute ago about, everyone here at Farm Credit's an expert in agriculture, but we all have specific pieces of agriculture that we may be a little more educated on. So I turned to a teammate of mine who has been lending money specifically for hog operations for 30 plus years. And I essentially facilitated a meeting between that individual and this operation that was looking at making the change, so that they could get the best advice that they could. Now, that by having that meeting, that operation now has another advisor sitting on their panel, or on their bench, excuse me. I'm still the primary contact that they call if they need anything or have questions, but they reach out to that other financial officer frequently to ask them questions about swine specifics, and I'm 100% okay with that. I think it's great, and I think that we've made our relationship stronger because we all knew our limits and had respect to grow with each other.
Well, Travis, that's really great. I think as advisors need to, if you're in an advising role, you need to think about what are the limits of the advice I'm giving, but also if you're receiving it, does this advisor know their limits, and are they going to stop at their limits? So that's really great. I have a couple of questions that we're going to carry over into overtime for you, and we're going to get to all the viewer submitted questions as well. But at this point, thank you so much, Travis. I'm going to kick it over to Carly to wrap us up before we get into overtime. Carly?
So next month's Two Economists and a Lender webinar will be on Thursday, August 24th, about evaluating cash rental rates. It's not just farmland values. Cash rental rates are also considerably higher in recent years. So we'll review the most recent data, consider how pricey conditions are, and discuss management strategies going forward into 2024. So look for a link to register for that. So let's go ahead and jump back over into that Q&A, because I do know we've got a couple things we want to get back to.
Travis, who is an advisor that you often see overlooked as individuals, or specifically producers that are listening today, are thinking about that bench that they're trying to build and curate?
That's a really good question, David. And where my mind goes with that is looking around your community at other individuals and other businesses that have been successful in their life and in their business, but maybe are not specifically involved in agriculture. An example of this may be a successful welding shop in your community. If you think about how that business operates, a welding shop, they have a high overhead because of all their machines. They have busy times of year, just like farmers. They have to work with suppliers to get all the materials to produce whatever they need to produce. They also have to manage employees. So they may be creating a different widget. They're not producing corn and soybeans, but they're still going through a lot of the same struggles that you as a farmer really are. So I would look to other people in your area that are in that do similar things on a day-to-day basis, but maybe not specifically in agriculture, and do that because you're going to be able to look outside the box a little bit more and view how to solve problems and build your business through a little bit different. And I think oftentimes in agriculture, it's such a tight-knit community that we oftentimes look at other successful farming operations in our community to model ourselves after. And although I think that's great, I do think there's a lot of benefit to look at it through a different lens and get an outside perspective. So if I'm looking for often overlooked advisors, I'd look for someone who does something similar to me, or has to make similar decisions, I should say, but isn't exactly in the exact same business that I am.
Well, that's a really great example. I think you think about the boards of directors for Fortune 500 companies, you start to see that type of crossover happen. So really appreciate that example here in this conversation.
Well, it's almost it's not really a question, but a comment. I think that one of the places, and I think it's spot on, where you can go to build your network is, local farm organizations that you can get involved with, things the university puts on, or any kind of learning event that companies might put on. And I think that's very true. And some of us aren't the best networkers in the world, but the more things you do, and I think much as Travis said, sometimes join some of those organizations that are maybe even outside of agriculture can help expose you to a whole host of different people that can give you a lot of good information and help shape your thinking. And back to that quote, and I think Travis had mentioned it today, that, and maybe I had heard that quote a long time ago. I think he's the one that found who said it, but he had used it too. Those 5 people that you're around a lot, it shapes how you think and what you do. And so never hurts to bring some diversity into that.
Yeah, and I think it's always good to keep in mind that networking is oftentimes where you start with building your board of advisors. Like, through networking, you will find the people that you trust and lean into the most. I think that's it. So that'll do it for another episode of Two Economists and a Lender. And thank you to Brent, David, and Travis for leading today's conversation. And for you in the audience, thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you online again next month.